The judge thought I was just some clueless kid, until I started tearing apart his case like I'd been doing it for years. The courtroom in downtown Los Angeles felt heavy, almost like the air itself was pressing down. Every seat in the gallery was filled, people whispering to each other as they waited to see what would happen. The defense table seemed too big for me as I stood beside it. My hands were shoved into my pockets, my chin tilted just enough to show I wasn't scared. My name's Ethan Miller. 19 years old. Charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, sure, but the way Judge Harold Johnson stared at me made it obvious this trial wasn't really about the law. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers lazily against the polished wood. He looked over the rim of his glasses at me, his mouth twisting somewhere between a smirk and a sneer. "So, you think you're some kind of legal hotshot?" he said, his voice dry and mocking. "This isn't debate club, kid." A few chuckles rolled through the courtroom, coming from the bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. But I didn't laugh. I didn't even flinch. I'd been preparing for a moment like this for years. Not this exact one, never thought I'd be the one standing trial, but I knew courtrooms better than most. While other kids kept up with sports stats, I memorized case law. While my friends played video games, I ran mock trials in my head, arguing imaginary cases to myself. My mom, Linda Miller, had worked as a paralegal for over 2 decades. I grew up listening to the stories she brought home, how prosecutors bent the rules, how judges played favorites, how some defense lawyers didn't even bother trying. I soaked it all up. By the time I was 14, I could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Judge Johnson. To him, I was just another punk kid in trouble. He sighed, flipping open the case file. "Let's make this quick. I've got a tea time at 2. The gallery laughed again, but this time I let a faint smirk tug at my lips. Because the judge had just made his first mistake. Not that anyone else in the room noticed. The prosecutor, Richard Coleman, stood up with the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. His suit was sharp, his tie perfect, and his voice carried that rehearsed strength of someone who delivered the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor," he said, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Ethan Miller, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6 reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers chased him through downtown, where he allegedly tried to run before being caught. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." His words carried weight. The crowd shifted in their seats, murmuring. On the surface, it sounded pretty bad. A stolen car. A chase. Running. Judge Johnson peered at me over his glasses, then nodded at the prosecutor to continue. Coleman walked toward the jury box, his shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to argue this was some misunderstanding, that Mr. Miller is just a victim of circumstance. But let's be honest, folks. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The room grew tense. Judge Johnson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. I didn't blink. Coleman shuffled through his papers. "Your Honor, we have the testimony of Officer David Ramirez, who personally saw the defendant behind the wheel before he tried to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was clean." The judge let out a sharp breath through his nose and nodded. "Sounds straightforward to me." And for most people in the room, it probably did. A stolen car. A chase. An arrest. Clear cut. But I'd studied enough trials to see the cracks. I stayed quiet, just watching. Waiting. Judge Johnson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right. Let's hear from the defense." He turned toward my lawyer, a public defender named Susan Grant, who had barely said a word since stepping into the courtroom. She stood, her voice trembling. "Your Honor, my client." I touched her arm gently, asking her to stop without saying a word. She hesitated, then sat back down. And that's when I finally spoke up. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The whole courtroom went dead silent. Judge Johnson stared at me, looking almost entertained. "You'll what?" he asked. "Myself," I said evenly. "I'll be defending myself." The whole courtroom rippled with murmurs. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Prosecutor Coleman's grin cracked for just a moment before he let out a sharp laugh. Well, this should be interesting. But nobody was laughing when I took that first step forward. Because everything was about to change. I stood taller, my hands still resting in my pockets, letting the silence drag on just enough to make people uncomfortable. Then I broke it. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to clear something up with the prosecution." Coleman folded his arms, raising an eyebrow. "Go ahead." I stepped forward slowly. "You said Officer David Ramirez personally saw me behind the wheel before the arrest, correct?" Coleman blew out a breath like he was already bored. "That's right." "And his testimony is written in his official report?" "Of course it is." I nodded once, then turned to Judge Johnson. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony." The judge squinted. "On what grounds?" For the first time, I pulled my hands from my pockets and pointed toward the prosecutor's table. "Because Officer Ramirez never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." Coleman's face twitched, just a flicker, but I caught it. "What are you talking about?" I took another step closer. "If the court allows, I'd like to request Officer Ramirez's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, the data should back that up." I paused. "But I've got a feeling it won't." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Johnson frowned, turning to Coleman. "Counselor." Coleman cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" I gave a slight shrug, casual as could be. "If the officer was where he said he was, the GPS will prove it. If not, I let the words trail off." Judge Johnson studied me for a long moment, then turned back to Coleman. "Does the prosecution have any objection to verifying the GPS records?" Coleman hesitated. The pause was long enough. The jury saw it. The gallery saw it. Most importantly, the judge saw it. I took a slow, steady breath. I'd watched enough trials to know the patterns, the tricks, the way prosecutors tried to bend the system. And there was one thing I knew for sure: if Coleman was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor." Coleman finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the damage was done. For the first time, the laughter was gone. The silence in the room was thick, and the tension was louder than anything. Coleman fumbled with his papers, his polished confidence slipping. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains, the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." I gave a small nod, keeping my face neutral. "That's true." I stepped forward again. "But let's talk about that for a moment." Judge Johnson arched an eyebrow, gesturing for me to go on. I turned to the jury, locking eyes with them one by one. "The prosecution wants you to believe that fingerprints in a car mean I stole it. That's their whole story. But let's think about it logically." I drew a breath, keeping my tone calm and steady. Say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then hang it back on the rack. Later that day, someone shoplifts the same jacket. Do your fingerprints mean you stole it? A few jurors glanced at each other. Someone in the gallery muttered under their breath. I didn't give them time to settle. That car. It was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before it was reported stolen. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yeah, when we walked out, I leaned against the car. Even opened the door, because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. I held their gaze. But I didn't take the car. Didn't drive it. Didn't steal a thing. It was just a dumb moment of curiosity, nothing more. I let that thought hang in the air, then asked in a voice sharp enough to slice through the silence. Does touching something make you a criminal? Prosecutor Coleman cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, clearly scrambling for a foothold. But I wasn't finished. And while we're at it, I said, turning toward the judge, let's talk about that fingerprint analysis. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist in this case subpoenaed to testify? Judge Johnson blinked, caught off guard. His eyes shifted toward Coleman. The prosecutor hesitated, then finally muttered, no. I pressed my lips together, then leaned in. So let me get this straight. The state is trying to convict me with forensic evidence, but they didn't bother to bring in the actual specialist who processed it. No chance for me to cross-examine, no way to ask about chain of custody, no opportunity to challenge the analysis. Coleman's jaw tightened. That was all I needed. I gave a little nod. Interesting. Judge Johnson sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. For the first time, he looked like a man realizing this trial wasn't the easy win he thought it would be. But I wasn't done. Because the next thing I had would turn everything upside down. Your Honor, I said, steady but firm, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. The judge frowned. The owner? Yes, sir. Mr. Robert Whitman, the registered owner of the stolen Audi. He gave a statement to the police that, for some reason, was left out of the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why. I turned back toward Coleman. Do you remember what Mr. Whitman told officers the night his car was reported stolen? Coleman's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what I was about to reveal. I didn't give him the chance. I pulled a printed transcript from my folder and began to read. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and driven off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid. And he was white. The words hit the room like a bomb. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I held the paper up. That's from the original police report. The same one the prosecution never mentioned. The arresting officer skipped over it in his testimony. The state ignored it. And yet, they expect this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Coleman rushed forward. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. I shook my head firmly. No, I wasn't. My voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room like glass. I was arrested blocks away from where the car was abandoned, walking home after grabbing snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is sloppy police work and lazy assumptions. Judge Johnson let out a long breath, rubbing at his temple. The case was unraveling, and everyone in the room could feel it. I turned to the jury, steady. The real suspect got away that night. The cops found a black kid in the area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about. The silence was suffocating. Judge Johnson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. Does the prosecution have anything further? Coleman stood stiff, his face red. No, Your Honor. The judge exhaled, staring at me, then glanced toward the jury. After a long pause, he leaned forward and said the words nobody expected. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted, half in disbelief, half in relief. Reporters scribbled furiously, the gallery buzzing. I didn't move right away. I let the moment breathe. Let everyone feel it. Judge Johnson still gripped his gavel, watching me with an unreadable look. And in his eyes, for the first time, I saw something new. Recognition. Maybe even regret. I met the judge's eyes, then turned to walk out. But just as I reached the door, his voice stopped me. "Mr. Miller." I froze, but I didn't turn back. There was a pause, then he said quietly, "You should consider law school." A smirk tugged at my mouth. Consider it? I already was. Outside, the courthouse steps were alive with noise. Reporters swarmed like bees, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward me. "Ethan, did you know the judge would throw out the case? What's next for you? How does it feel to outsmart a veteran prosecutor?" I yanked my hoodie over my head and kept moving. I didn't care about the spotlight. This wasn't about proving I was clever, it was about something bigger. At the bottom of the steps, my mom, Linda, was waiting. Arms crossed, face unreadable. She just looked at me for a long moment before finally shaking her head and letting out a deep sigh. "Boy, you scared me half to death." I scratched the back of my head and chuckled. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She stared at me for another second, then pulled me into a hug so tight it almost knocked the air out of me. "You always were the stubborn one." The cameras kept snapping, reporters shouting, but I didn't notice them anymore. Across the street, Judge Johnson stood beside his car, watching. His posture was different now, the arrogance gone. His expression wasn't amused. It was thoughtful. He hadn't expected this case to be anything but routine. Just another file, another defendant, another conviction. But now he knew he'd remember it. Because I had done something most people never got the chance to do, I made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first. That's the real lesson here. How many other cases had gone the same way? How many people had been convicted, not because of solid evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, or a system more interested in closing cases than uncovering the truth? I had the knowledge to push back. But what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just about me. It was about all of them. I knew what I had to do next. That courtroom wouldn't be the last one I ever stood in. But the next time, I wouldn't be the defendant. I'd be the attorney. And when that day came, I wouldn't be standing alone. Because if this story made you stop and think, even for a moment, then share it. The justice system runs on laws, but it's carried out by people. And people can change, if we make them.